Good morning, everybody. Good to be with you. Today, I wanted to go over this article by Leo Strauss on existentialism. This was delivered in 1956 at the Hillel Foundation of the University of Chicago, and it's one of the more extended cases where you'll see Strauss talking about Martin Heidegger, somebody who was so important to him, and somebody in some sense who's Strauss's secret interlocutor throughout all of Strauss's works. In other words, Heidegger, as you'll see from this lecture, is of the greatest significance for Strauss, who thought that he was the greatest thinker of our time. And therefore, I thought it would be interesting for us to go over this article or this essay or speech that Strauss gave together. So here we go, Leo Strauss on existentialism. This series of lectures, he says, a reminder of the perplexities of modern man, should help the Jewish students in particular toward facing the perplexities of the modern Jew with somewhat greater clarity. Existentialism has reminded many people that thinking is incomplete and defective if the thinking being, the thinking individual, forgets himself as what he is. It is the old Socratic warning. So just note here, okay? Existentialism is reminding us of something that Socrates had also warned us about. So there's immediately established a kind of kinship between the old Socratic way and the existentialist way. We'll have to see whether that kinship is a one-to-one correspondence all the way through. So existentialism has reminded many people that thinking is incomplete and defective if the thinking being, the thinking individual, forgets himself as what he is. It is the old Socratic warning. Compare Theodorus in the Theaetetus, a dialogue of Plato's, the purely theoretic, purely objective man who loses himself completely in the contemplation of mathematical objects, who knows nothing about himself and his fellow man, in particular about his own defects. The thinking man is not a pure mind, a pointer reading observer, for instance. The question what I am or who I am cannot be answered by science, for this would mean that there are some self-forgetting Theodoruses, in other words, people who are for whom science is the authority, who have gotten hold of the limits of the human soul by means of the scientific method. For if they have not done so, if their results are necessarily provisional, hypothetical, it is barely possible that what we can find out by examining ourselves and our situation honestly, without the pride and pretense of scientific knowledge, is more helpful than science. In other words, what do we see here right off the bat? Existentialism, like the old Socratic philosophy, is interested in more than just the pride and pretense of scientific knowledge, the limits of which Plato showed through the character Theodorus. Rather, it reminds us that we have to raise the question, what am I or who am I? A question that cannot be answered by science. So let's continue. Existentialism is a school of philosophic thought. The name is not like Platonism, Epicureanism, and Thomism. Existentialism is a nameless movement like pragmatism or positivism. This is deceptive, Strauss writes. Existentialism owes its overriding significance to a single man, Heidegger. Heidegger alone brought about such a radical change in philosophic thought as is revolutionizing all thought in Germany, in continental Europe, and is beginning to affect even Anglo-Saxony. I am not surprised by this effect, Strauss says. I remember the impression he, Heidegger, made on me when I first heard him as a young PhD in 1922. Up to that time, I had been particularly impressed, as many of my contemporaries in Germany were, Strauss writes, by Max Weber, by Weber's intransigent devotion to intellectual honesty, by his passionate devotion to the idea of science, a devotion that was combined with a profound uneasiness regarding the meaning of science. On my way north from Freiburg, where Heidegger then taught, I saw in Frankfurt am Main Franz Rosenzweig, whose name will always be remembered when informed people speak about existentialism, and I told him of Heidegger. So Strauss is discussing the time that he talked with Rosenzweig about Heidegger. I said to him, in comparison with Heidegger, Weber appeared to me as an orphan child in regard to precision and probing and competence. I had never seen before such seriousness, profundity, and concentration in the interpretation of philosophic texts. I had heard Heidegger's interpretation of certain sections of Aristotle, Strauss writes. Sometime later, I heard Werner Jaeger in Berlin interpret the same texts. Charity compels me to limit the comparison to the remark that there was no comparison. In other words, there was nothing compared to Heidegger in precision, probing, and competence, seriousness, profundity, and concentration. Gradually, the breadth of the revolution of thought which Heidegger was preparing dawned upon me and my generation, Strauss writes. We saw with our own eyes that there had been no such phenomenon in the world since Hegel. He succeeded in a very short time in dethroning the established schools of philosophy in Germany. There was a famous discussion between Heidegger and Cassirer in Davos, which revealed the lostness and emptiness of this remarkable representative of established academic philosophy to everyone who had eyes. Okay, by the way, you can read about that debate between Heidegger and Cassirer in Davos. What's the name of the book I'm thinking of? By Peter Ellie Gordon. I think it's called Continental Divide. One of, I think, a few books written on that debate. Cassirer, who debated Heidegger at Davos, had been a pupil of Hermann Cohen, the founder of the Neo-Kantian school. Cohen had elaborated a system of philosophy whose center was ethics. Cassirer had transformed Cohen's system into a new system of philosophy in which ethics had completely disappeared. It had been silently dropped. He had not faced the problem. Heidegger did face the problem. He declared that ethics is impossible, and his whole being was permeated by the awareness that this fact opens up an abyss. Prior to Heidegger's emergence, the most outstanding German philosopher, I would say the only German philosopher, was Edmund Husserl. It was Heidegger's critique of Husserl's phenomenology which became decisive, Strauss writes, precisely because that criticism consisted in a radicalization of Husserl's own question and questioning. Okay, so in some sense, Heidegger says that fundamental ontology is phenomenology radicalized. Okay, and Strauss alluding to that here. Briefly, as Husserl once said to me, Strauss writes, who had been trained in the Marburg Neo-Kantian school, the Neo-Kantians were superior to all other German philosophical schools, but they made the mistake of beginning with the roof. He meant the primary theme of Marburg Neo-Kantianism was the analysis of science. But science, Husserl taught, is derivative from our primary understanding of the world of things. Science is not the perfection of man's understanding of the world, but a specific modification of that pre-scientific understanding. Okay, this is crucial that you get what he's saying here when he refers to Husserl and to the Marburg Neo-Kantian school. Let me get that once more here. So science, can I highlight this and underline it? I don't think so. Anyways, you see, science, Husserl taught, is derivative from our primary knowledge of the world of things. Science is not the perfection of man's understanding of the world, but a specific modification of that pre-scientific understanding. Okay, Strauss took this insight, which he learned from Husserl and which Heidegger developed and applied over the course of the history of philosophy, to political science. You see, because the implication here is that a scientific social science or a scientific political science is not the perfection of our understanding of politics and society, because it rests on a specific modification of a pre-scientific understanding. And unless we've really grasped that pre-scientific understanding, the science stands on shaky foundations. You can't just dismiss everything pre-scientific as irrational, mythological, prejudice, and so on. If science is a specific modification of the pre-scientific understanding, you need, as it were, a pre-scientific phenomenology of political life, in the case of political science, or a phenomenology in the deeper sense for Heidegger and his history of philosophy. So I just want to highlight that for you in case you don't stick around, or you tune out, or you just want one idea isolated from the rest of the essay, one that you can take home and chew on. But to continue, the meaningful genesis of science out of pre-scientific understanding is a problem. The primary theme is the philosophical understanding of the pre-scientific world, and therefore, in the first place, the analysis of the sensibly perceived thing. And you may know Heidegger has an inquiry, what is a thing? So that's something to think about. According to Heidegger, Husserl himself began with the roof. The merely sensibly perceived thing is itself derivative. There are not first sensibly perceived things and thereafter the same things in a state of being valued or a state of affecting us. I'll explain this in a minute. Our primary understanding of the world is not an understanding of things as objects, but of what the Greeks indicated by pragmata, things which we handle and use. So let me just say that very quickly, if need be. So it's not the scientific explanation of the world that's primary. It's something earlier than that, something simpler than that, something more naive than that, something that we have there for us before a scientific world construction, before we have a scientific explanation of reality, okay, before mathematical physics is draped over the world as the main manner of interpretation. So those who start with science start with the roof. But Husserl said, take a step back to the pre-scientific and start with the analysis of a thing and how the thing gets valued and so on, how it gets understood and interpreted. But Heidegger said, Husserl, you're already too far ahead in the race. You also need to take a few steps back. We don't encounter objects that get valued. Okay, this is what Strauss is saying here in characterizing Heidegger's response to Husserl. We have the world in which we do things. So, to use my infinitely overused example, here's my cup of coffee. It's not best understood in terms of mathematical physics. It's not best characterized as a bundle of sense perceptions or sense data. It's not even first understood as a thing to which I add value. It's, the cup of hot coffee that is within reach that I'm drinking to stay stimulated and hydrated and all the rest of it during this lecture. In other words, Heidegger turned our attention, in particular in Being and Time, to what Husserl called our life world, the world in which we are embedded and in which we have all of our doings. So not only is that before the interpretation of the world through the lens of mathematical physics and this scientific net that's cast over everything, captures it, and allows us to calculate it, it's also more fundamental, according to Strauss's presentation of Heidegger, than even Husserl's kind of phenomenology. So it's a radicalization of phenomenology. Husserl got us closer to the pre-scientific, but Heidegger takes us even further by talking about being in the world and all of that. Okay, so hopefully you found that to be helpful. Let's go back to the essay here. Our primary understanding of the world is not an understanding of things as objects, but of what the Greeks indicated by pragmata, things which we handle and use. Okay, as I said, my cup of coffee or pen, hammer, all those other examples. Okay, they're usable utensils and implements. The horizon within which Husserl had analyzed the world of pre-scientific understanding was the pure consciousness as the absolute being. Okay, a very brilliant and important and long-lasting insight of Husserlian phenomenology is sort of even a radicalization of Descartes, where you get into the realm of objects in consciousness, for consciousness, the world as reduced to the world for you. Okay, in other words, you can access a plane of consciousness through Husserl in a crucial way, but consciousness is still not the depth to which Heidegger wants to take us. That's what Strauss is alluding to here. The horizon within which Husserl had analyzed the world of pre-scientific understanding was the pure consciousness as the absolute being. Heidegger questioned that orientation by referring to the fact that the inner time belonging to the pure consciousness cannot be understood if one abstracts from the fact that this time is necessarily finite and even constituted by man's mortality. You maybe have heard being towards death and all of that. The same effect which Heidegger had in the late 20s and early 30s in Germany, he had very soon in continental Europe as a whole. There is no longer in existence a philosophic position apart from Neo-Thomism and Marxism, crude or refined. And then one of my favorite lines in all of Strauss concerning Heidegger, and in all literature concerning Heidegger, I would say, all rational liberal philosophic positions have lost their significance and power. Okay, keep in mind Strauss writing this in the 50s. And just listen. All rational, liberal philosophic positions have lost their significance and power. One may deplore this, but I, for one, cannot bring myself to clinging to philosophic positions which have been shown to be inadequate. I am afraid that we shall have to make a very great effort in order to find a solid basis for rational liberalism. Only a great thinker could help us in our intellectual plight, but here is the great trouble. The only great thinker in our time is Heidegger. Okay, I've referred to this passage many, many times in my book and essays that I've written on Strauss and Heidegger. This is worth chewing on, especially if you're hearing it for the first time. The only question of importance, of course, Strauss continues, is the question whether Heidegger's teaching is true or not. But in other words, it's more important whether it's true or not than it is whether it's compatible with liberalism or not. But the very question is deceptive because it's silent about the question of competence, of who is competent to judge. Perhaps only great thinkers are really competent to judge of the thought of great thinkers. Kant made a distinction between philosophers and those for whom philosophy is identical with the history of philosophy. He made a distinction, in other words, between the thinker and the scholar. I know, Strauss says, that I am only a scholar. But I also know that most people that call themselves philosophers are mostly at best scholars. The scholar is radically dependent on the work of the great thinkers, of men who faced the problems without being covered by any authority. The scholar is cautious, methodic, not bold. He does not become lost to our sight in, to us, inaccessible heights and mists as the great thinkers do. Yet, while the great thinkers are so bold, they are also so much more cautious than we are. They see pitfalls where we are sure of our ground. We scholars live in a charmed circle, light living like the Homeric gods, protected against the problems by the great thinkers. The scholar becomes possible through the fact that the great thinkers disagree. Their disagreement creates a possibility for us to reason about their differences, for wondering which of them is more likely to be right. We may think that the possible alternatives are exhausted by the great thinkers of the past. We may try to classify their doctrines and make a kind of herbarium and think that we look over them from a vantage point. But we cannot exclude the possibility that other great thinkers might arise in the future, in 2200 in Burma, the character of whose thought has in no way been provided for by our schemata. For who are we to believe that we have found out the limits of human possibilities? In brief, we are occupied with reasoning about the little we understand of what the great thinkers have said. Let me just remind you how we get here, okay? Heidegger is the greatest thinker of our time. The only question of importance is whether he's right. But it's hard to imagine that we have the competence to judge of the correctness of a great thinker. But we can be scholars. We can put the accounts of the great thinkers against one another and try to think them through since they disagree. And as he just said, their disagreement creates a possibility for us to reason about their differences. We are then occupied with reasoning about the little we have understood of what the great thinkers have said, and that must include, at least for Strauss, Heidegger, since Heidegger is the greatest thinker of our time. At least the greatest thinker since Hegel. The scholar faces the fundamental problems through the intermediacy of books. If he is a serious man, through the intermediacy of the great books. The great thinker faces the problems directly. Okay, so we learn about the great thinkers through the study of their books. The great thinkers learned about the problems by facing them directly. I apply, Strauss says, this to my situation in regard to Heidegger. A famous psychologist I saw in Europe, an old man, told me that in his view, it is not yet possible to form a judgment about the significance as well as the truth of Heidegger's work, because this work changed the intellectual orientation so radically that a long, long time is needed in order to understand with even tolerable adequacy and in a most general way what this work means. The more I understand what Heidegger is aiming at, Strauss says, the more I see how much still escapes me. The most stupid thing I could do would be to close my eyes or to reject his work. Incidentally, I add, is something that a lot of people still do. A very stupid thing indeed. But, Strauss continues, there is a not altogether unrespectable justification for doing so, okay, for rejecting Heidegger's work. Heidegger became a Nazi in 1933. This was not due to a mere error of judgment on the part of a man who lived on the great heights, high above the lowland of politics. Everyone who had read his first great book and did not overlook the wood for the trees could see the kinship in temper and direction between Heidegger's thought and the Nazis. What was the practical, that is to say, serious meaning of the contempt for reasonableness and the praise of resoluteness which permeated the work, except to encourage that extremist movement? When Heidegger was rector of the University of Freiburg in 1933, he delivered an official speech in which he identified himself with the movement which then swept Germany. Heidegger has not yet dared to mention that speech. Remember, Strauss is writing in 1957. Heidegger has not yet dared to mention that speech in the otherwise complete list of his writings, which appear from time to time on the book jackets of his recent publications. Yet in 1953, he published a book, Lectures Given in 1935, in which he spoke of the greatness and dignity of the National Socialist movement. In the preface written in 1953, he said that all mistakes had been corrected. The case of Heidegger reminds to a certain extent the case of Nietzsche. Nietzsche naturally would not have sided with Hitler, yet there is an undeniable kinship between Nietzsche's thought and fascism. If one rejects as passionately as Nietzsche did the conservative constitutional monarchy as well as democracy, with a view to a new aristocracy, the passion of the denials will be much more effective than the necessarily more subtle intimations of the character of the new nobility. And I add that you do have such subtle intimations not only in Nietzsche, but also in Heidegger, who writes, for example, about the future ones, quote unquote, in his book Contributions to Philosophy of the Event. To say nothing of his blonde beast, as Strauss writes, referring to Nietzsche. Passionate political action against such things is absolutely in order, but it is not sufficient. It is not even politically sufficient. Are there no dangers threatening democracy not only from without, but from within as well? Is there no problem of democracy, of industrial mass democracy? The official high priests of democracy, with their amiable reasonableness, were not reasonable enough to prepare us for our situation. The decline of Europe, okay, remember 60 years ago he's writing, the decline of Europe, the danger to the West, to the whole Western heritage, which is at least as great and even greater than that which threatened Mediterranean civilization around 300 of the Christian era. It is childish to believe that the UN organization is an answer even to the political problem. And within democracy, it suffices to mention the name of France and the commercials and logical positivism with their indescribable vulgarity. They have indeed the merit of not sending men into concentration camps and gas chambers, but is the absence of these unspeakable evils sufficient? Nietzsche once described the change which had been effected in the second half of the 19th century in continental Europe as follows. The reading of the morning prayer had been replaced by the reading of the morning paper. Not every day the same thing, the same reminder of men's absolute duty and exalted destiny, but every day something new, with no reminder of duty and exalted destiny. Specialization, knowing more and more about less and less. Practical impossibility of concentration upon the very few essential things upon which man's wholeness entirely depends. This specialization compensated by a sham universality, by the stimulation of all kinds of interests and curiosities without true passion, the danger of universal Philistinism and creeping conformism. Or, remember addressing a Jewish audience here at the Hillel House, or let me look for a moment at the Jewish problem. The nobility of Israel is literally beyond praise, the only bright spot for the contemporary Jew who knows where he comes from. And yet Israel does not afford a solution to the Jewish problem, the quote-unquote Judeo-Christian tradition. This means to blur and to conceal grave differences. Cultural pluralism can only be had, it seems, at the price of blunting all edges. And then another great line that I've quoted before and that you should inscribe upon your heart and mind if you're a thinking person. He says, "It would be wholly unworthy of us as thinking beings not to listen to the critics of democracy, even if they are enemies of democracy, provided they are thinking men and especially great thinkers and not blustering fools." So I would say that's all the excuse you ever need to study someone like Nietzsche and Heidegger, if you ever need an excuse, because it would be wholly unworthy of us as thinking beings not to. As you may recall, Strauss continues, from Mr. Gurevich's lecture, I guess one that preceded Strauss's in the order of affairs that day, existentialism appeals to a certain experience, anguish or anxiety, commonly translated in English as anxiety, as the basic experience in the light of which everything must be understood. Having this experience is one thing, regarding it as the basic experience is another. Its basic character is not guaranteed by the experience itself. It can only be guaranteed by argument. This argument may be invisible because it is implied in what is generally admitted in our time. What is generally admitted may imply, but only imply, a fundamental uneasiness, which is vaguely felt but not faced. Given this context, a context in which there's this uneasiness that is vaguely felt but not faced, the experience to which existentialism refers, anxiety, will appear as a revelation, as the authentic interpretation of the fundamental uneasiness. But something more is required, which, however, is equally generally admitted in our time. The vaguely felt uneasiness must be regarded as essential to man, and not only to present-day man. I add here, off the remarks of the essay, Heidegger will not be giving us an account of human existence if he points to this vaguely felt uneasiness as essential, whereas it's only characteristic of modern man, because then he will have left out everybody who's not modern man from his account of man, which is not satisfying. Yet this vaguely felt uneasiness is distinctly, as Strauss continues, a present-day phenomenon. Let us assume, however, that this uneasiness embodies what all earlier ages have thought, is the result of what earlier ages have thought. In that case, the vaguely felt uneasiness is the mature fruit of all earlier human efforts. No return to an older interpretation of that uneasiness is possible. Now, this is a second view generally accepted today, apart from the fundamental uneasiness which is vaguely felt but not faced. The second element is the belief in progress. I don't know whether you caught that. Two generally accepted positions today. Number one, that there's a vaguely felt uneasiness that Heidegger helped to put his finger on in talking about anxiety, angst. And number two, that this vaguely felt uneasiness is the result of history, that it is the culmination of a process. Or as Strauss puts it here, the second element is the belief in progress. I have already referred to the well-known expression, we know more and more about less and less. What does this mean? It means that modern science has not kept the promise which it held out from its beginning up to the end of the 19th century, that it would reveal to us the true character of the universe and the truth about man. You have in the Education of Henry Adams a memorable document of the change in the character and in the claim of science, which made itself felt in the general public towards the end of the last century, and which has increased since in momentum and sweep. You all know, he says, the assertion that value judgments are impermissible to the scientist in general and to the social scientist in particular. Strauss referring here to the fact-value distinction, the idea that science is primarily or solely about facts and must withhold value judgments. I think a view that now has been overcome, tilted in the direction that science cannot permit itself fact judgments that don't lean in a progressive direction. Anyway, let me go back to where we are here. This means that certainly while science has increased man's power in ways that former men never dreamt of, it is absolutely incapable to tell men how to use that power. Science cannot tell him whether it is wiser to use that power wisely and beneficently or foolishly and devilishly. From this, it follows that science is unable to establish its own meaningfulness or to answer the question whether and in what sense science is good. We are then confronted with an enormous apparatus whose bulk is ever increasing, but which in itself has no meaning. If a scientist would say, as Goethe as Mephisto still said, that science and reason is man's highest power, he would be told that he is not talking as a scientist, but was making a value judgment, which from the point of view of science is altogether unwarranted. Someone has spoken of a flight from scientific reason. This flight is not due to any perversity, but to science itself. I, Strauss writes, dimly remember the time when people argued as follows. To deny the possibility of science or rational value judgments means to admit that all values are of equal rank. And this means that respect for all values, universal tolerance, is the dictate of scientific reason. But this time has gone. Today we hear that no conclusion whatever can be drawn from the equality of all values, that science does not legitimate nor indeed forbid that we should draw rational conclusions from scientific findings. The assumption that we should act rationally and therefore turn to science for reliable information, this assumption is wholly outside the purview and interest of science proper. The flight from scientific reason is the consequence of the flight of science from reason, from the notion that man is a rational being who perverts his being if he does not act rationally. So Strauss is tracing here a theme that he was interested in many of his books. The fact that science failed to give us a meaningfully guided life, and that had something to do with the fact-value distinction, and that you should overcome the fact-value distinction and the nature of modern science, get back, if possible, to classical political science, which was able to treat man as a rational being and was able to say something about a well-lived, well-guided life. To continue, it goes without saying that a science which does not allow of value judgments has no longer any possibility of speaking of progress, except in the humanly irrelevant sense of scientific progress. The concept of progress has accordingly been replaced by the concept of change. If science or reason cannot answer the question of why science is good, of why sufficiently gifted and otherwise able people fulfill a duty in devoting themselves to science, science says in effect that the choice of science is not rational. One may choose with equal right pleasing and otherwise satisfying myths. Furthermore, science does no longer conceive of itself as the perfection of the human understanding, which it once did. It admits that it is based on fundamental hypotheses which will always remain hypotheses. The whole structure of science does not rest on evident necessities. If this is so, okay, if science is baseless, groundless, okay, not rooted in evident necessities, the choice of the scientific orientation is as groundless as the choice of any alternative orientation. But what else does this mean except that the reflective scientist discovers as the ground of his science and his choice of science, a groundless choice, an abyss? For a scientific interpretation of the choice of the scientific orientation on one hand and the choice of alternative orientations on the other presupposes already the acceptance of the scientific orientation. The fundamental freedom is the only non-hypothetical phenomenon. Everything else rests on that fundamental freedom. We are already in the midst of existentialism. So, in some sense, you could ask, why has Strauss been writing in this essay on existentialism so much about science? Because we get to the realm of existentialism in part through the view that the promise of science comes up short, and the scientist is faced not with a scientifically rational and defensible ground for not only his undertaking but his way of life, but instead faced with an abyss. The groundlessness of science opens the door to the midst of existentialism. Continuing here, someone might say that science by itself, as well as poor and stupid positivism, are of course helpless against the existentialist onslaught. But do we not have a rational philosophy which takes up the thread where science and positivism drop it, and for which poetic emotional existentialism is no match? So maybe between existentialism on one hand and the positivistic science which fails to say anything meaningful about human life on the other hand, maybe there's a third way. Strauss says, I have asked myself for a long time, where do I find that rational philosophy? Okay, neither the modern scientific one nor the existentialist one. If I disregard the Neo-Thomists, followers of St. Thomas Aquinas, where do I find today the philosopher who dares to say that he is in possession of the true metaphysics and the true ethics, which reveal to us in a rational, universally valid way the nature of being and the character of the good life? Naturally, Strauss continues, we can sit at the feet of the great philosophers of old, of Plato and of Aristotle. But who can dare to say that Plato's doctrine of ideas, as he intimated it, or Aristotle's doctrine of the nous, that does nothing but think itself and is essentially related to the eternal visible universe, is the true teaching? Are those like myself who are inclined to sit at the feet of the old philosophers, not exposed to the danger of a weak-kneed eclecticism, which will not withstand a single blow on the part of those who are competent enough to remind them of the singleness of purpose and of inspiration that characterizes every thinker who deserves to be called great? Considering the profound disagreement among the great thinkers of the past, is it possible to appeal to them without blunting all edges? Remember, Strauss referred to that earlier in the Judeo-Christian, right? If you have these different schools of thought, either maybe you're all in on one of them, or if you are going from school to school, aren't you blunting the edges of their differences? The place of rational philosophy proper is taken more and more by what was called in the country of its origin, Weltanschauungslehre, theory of comprehensive views. Okay, Weltanschauung is usually translated like a worldview. Okay, but like a worldview. So the theory of comprehensive views or the theory of worldviews. In this stage, it is admitted that we cannot refer to the true metaphysical and ethical teaching available in any of the great thinkers of the past. It is admitted that there are n ways of answering the fundamental questions, that there are n types of absolute presuppositions, as Collingwood called them, none of which can be said to be rationally superior to any other. This means to abandon the very idea of truth as a rational philosophy has always understood it. It means, just as in the case of the social scientists, that the choice of any one of these presuppositions is groundless. We are thus led again to the abyss of freedom. Guys, you understand the problem, right? You have Plato, Aristotle, Nietzsche, Heidegger, great thinkers. Add to the list or subtract from it like you prefer. Spinoza, Leibniz, Kant, Hegel. And you say, which, if any of them, is true? You say, we can no longer even ask that question. This one has presuppositions A, this one has presuppositions B, this one has presuppositions C. And you know what? Your choice for A, B, and C is a groundless choice. And therefore, the fundamental fact is your freedom. Existential freedom. Okay, so to say nothing of the fact that any such doctrine of comprehensive views presupposes that the fundamental possibilities are available or that the fundamental human creativity is at its end. Furthermore, there's a radical disproportion between the analyst of comprehensive views, who does not face the fundamental questions directly and does not even recognize them in their primary meaning, as pointing to one answer only, and the great thinkers themselves. He is separated from them by a deep gulf, which is created by his pretended knowledge of the utopian character of the original philosophy itself. I just want to say this very quickly. The one who's like, I'm going to examine Kant and Plato and Aristotle, and I'm analyzing them as worldviews. This person is completely barred from access to the significance of any one of those doctrines because they didn't think of themselves as worldviews, let's say in most cases, but as the true account of the whole, of the nature of being and the nature of man. So if you treat them as merely worldviews and you line them up sort of from a no man's land perspective, analyze them in that way, you're on completely different grounds than the great thinkers themselves. You probably think that you're superior to them because you know that their thoughts are worldviews and they didn't know that about themselves. But that's obviously delusional. Okay, so how can we possibly believe that he, the scholar, is in a position to understand the thinkers as they want to be understood and as they must have been understood if one is to order and tabulate their teachings? We are sufficiently familiar with the history of moral philosophy in particular in order not to be taken in for one moment by the pious hope that while there may be profound disagreements among the rational philosophers in all other respects, that they will happily agree regarding human conduct. There's only one possible way out of the predicament in which the doctrine of comprehensive views finds itself, and that is to find the ground of the variety of comprehensive views in the human soul, or more generally stated, in the human condition. If one takes this indispensable step, one is again already at the threshold of existentialism. Okay, let me just comment very quickly. So one way that we got to the threshold of existentialism or to the midst of existentialism was through a reflection on the groundlessness of science. But now we have also through the multiplicity of quote-unquote worldviews access to the same point, because if you want to ground the multiplicity of so-called worldviews and you ground them in the human soul or the human condition, then you are right there on the cusp of existentialism. I hope you guys are enjoying this. Leo Strauss's essay on existentialism. It came up in a private tutoring session recently that I was leading, and I thought, you know what, let's just go over it together on a live stream. So here we are. Continuing, there's another very common way of solving the so-called value problem. People say that we must adopt values and that it is natural for us to adopt the values of our society. Our values are our highest principles if the meaning of science itself depends on values. Now, it is impossible to overlook the relation of the principles of our society to our society and the dependence of the principles on the society. This means, generally stated, that the principles, the so-called categorical system, or the essences, I'll explain this in a minute, are rooted ultimately in the particular, in something which exists. Existence precedes essence. For what else do people mean when they say, for example, that the Stoic natural law teaching is rooted in or relative to the decay of the Greek polis, and the emergence of the Greek Empire. Or, there's a book called Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy, recently published, which argues somehow that categories of philosophy and tyranny are related to the decay of a Greek aristocracy. So what's the point here? Imagine you have basic concepts: liberty, equality, tolerance, freedom, or whatever, superiority, hierarchy, conquest. You have some basic categories. And the idea is that those basic categories shape what can be seen and how it's interpreted. But if they're a function of the specific type of society that you happen to find yourselves in, then the fact of the society, existence, precedes the categorical system, essence. And that formula, existence precedes essence, is, for the purposes of this presentation, an existentialist formula. Okay? Does that make sense? So if the values are relative to the type of society, then you are once again in the direction of existentialism in this analysis. As I said, Strauss continues, sometimes people try to avoid the difficulty indicated by saying that we have to adopt the values of our society. This is altogether impossible for serious men. We cannot help raising the question as to the value of the values of our society. Okay, you have to understand how crucial that is. A short formulation that encompasses a lifetime of work here. We cannot help raising the question as to the value of the values of our society. To accept the values of one society because they are the values of one society means simply to shirk one's responsibility, not to face the situation that everyone has to make his own choice, to run away from one's self. To find the solution to our problem in the acceptance of our values of our society, of the values of our society, because that's what they are, means to make Philistinism a duty and to make oneself oblivious to the difference between true individuals and whitened sepulchres. In other words, you can't just do what everybody else is doing. You can't just follow. You can't be for LGBTQ++, exclamation mark, just because society is. And you also can't just be for, your wars of territorial expansion just because society is. If you're a thinking being, you have to think about the principles of your society. You can't not just merely follow them like a lemming. The uneasiness which today is felt but not faced can be expressed by a single word, Strauss writes: relativism. Existentialism admits the truth of relativism, but it realizes that relativism, so far from being a solution or even a relief, is deadly. Existentialism is the reaction of serious men to their own relativism. So let's see how he develops that thought. Existentialism begins then with the realization that as the ground of all objective rational knowledge, we discover an abyss. So we had expected from science objective rational knowledge. We didn't find it. We found instead an abyss. So it begins with that realization. All truth, all meaning is seen in the last analysis to have no support except man's freedom. Objectively, there is in the last analysis only meaninglessness, nothingness. This nothingness can be experienced in anguish, but this experience cannot find an objective expression because it cannot be made in detachment. Man freely originates meaning. He originates the horizon, the absolute presupposition, the ideal, the project within which understanding and life are possible. Man is man by virtue of such a horizon-forming project, of an unsupported project, of a throne project. Referring here, Strauss is very deliberately to existentials from Heidegger's work, Being and Time. More precisely, a man always lives already within such a horizon without being aware of its character. He takes his world as simply given, i.e., he has lost himself, but he can call himself back from his lostness and take the responsibility for what he was in a lost, inauthentic way. Okay, Strauss also describing here the movement of Being and Time from inauthenticity to authenticity. Man is essentially a social being. To be a human being means to be with other human beings. Or I add here in the language of Being and Time that being in the world is always being with others. Okay, Dasein is Mitsein. To be in an authentic way means to be in an authentic way with others. To be true to oneself is incompatible with being false to others. Thus, there would seem to exist the possibility of an existentialist ethics, which would have, however, to be a strictly formal ethics. And by the way, there are people who have taken Heidegger's comments on being with others and tried to make of them certain ethics. However this may be, Heidegger never believed in the possibility of an ethics. To be a human being means to be in the world. To be authentic means to be authentic in the world. To accept the things within the world as merely factual and as one's own being as merely factual. To risk oneself resolutely, despising sham certainties, and all objective certainties are sham. Only if man is in this way do the things in the world reveal themselves to him as they are. So this is Strauss paraphrasing as simply and as best as he can, for sure as simply as he can, those passages in Heidegger's Being and Time that deal with resoluteness. The concern with objective certainty necessarily narrows the horizon. It leads to the consequence that man erects around himself an artificial setting which conceals from him the abyss of which he must be aware if he wants to be truly human. To live dangerously means to think exposedly. Okay, exposed to the abyss, exposed to nothing, exposed to what stands on the other side of objective certainties. Okay, something that Heidegger describes very compellingly. We are ultimately confronted with mere facticity or contingency, but are we not able and even compelled to raise the question of the causes of ourselves and of the things in the world? Indeed, we cannot help raising the question of the where and whither, or of the whole. But we do not know and cannot know the where and whither and the whole. Man cannot understand himself in light of the whole, in light of his origin or his end. This irredeemable ignorance is the basis of his lostness, or the core of the human situation. By making this assertion, existentialism restores Kant's notion of the unknowable thing in itself, and of man's ability to grasp the fact of his freedom at the limits of objective knowledge and as the ground of objective knowledge. But, unlike in Kant, in existentialism there is no moral law and no other world. It becomes necessary to make as fully explicit as possible the character of human existence, to raise the question what is human existence, and to bring to light the essential structures of human existence. This inquiry is called by Heidegger analytics of existence, or analytic of Dasein in Being and Time. Heidegger conceived of the analytics of existence from the outset as the fundamental ontology. This means he took up again Plato and Aristotle's question, what is being? What is that by virtue of which any being is said to be? Heidegger agreed with Plato and Aristotle not only as to this, that the question of what is to be is the fundamental question. He also agreed with Plato and Aristotle as to this, that the fundamental question must primarily be addressed to that being which is in the most emphatic or most authoritative way, okay, namely the human being. Yet while according to Plato and Aristotle, to be in the highest sense means to be always, Heidegger contends that to be in the highest sense means to exist. That is to say, to be in the manner in which man is, to be in the highest sense is constituted by mortality. So we saw earlier, I want to make sure I don't lose this, where are we, page 312? If we go all the way back up to the opening remarks, what did we see and what did we say? That existentialism, which was a denial of the primacy of science, was a reminder of the old Socratic warning, because we saw the character of Theodorus in the Theaetetus telling us that purely objective theoretic contemplation of mathematical things is enough, but Socrates warned us against Theodorus, and Heidegger warns us against the modern Theodoruses, the modern scientific men. So there was a kinship between Heidegger and Plato, existentialism and Socratism, regarding the inadequacy of the scientific outlook, kinship. But as we move down here, we see that beyond the kinship, there's a fundamental distinction, a fundamental difference. That according to Plato and Aristotle, to be in the highest sense means to be always, whereas for Heidegger, to be is to be finite, to be temporal, to be constituted by mortality. Very key difference, despite their similarity. So if we're going to take up Strauss's, what Strauss said about being a scholar means taking the differences among the great thinkers and trying to think them through, then for sure that would be one fitting place to start. Philosophy thus becomes analytics of existence. Analytics of existence brings to light the essential structures, the unchangeable character of existence. Okay, referring here in a nutshell to Heidegger's project in Being and Time. Is then the new philosophy, in spite of the difference of content, objective rational philosophy, comparable to Kant's transcendental analytics of subjectivity? Does not the new philosophy too take on the character of absolute knowledge, complete knowledge, final knowledge, infinite knowledge? No. The new philosophy, Strauss writes, is necessarily based on a specific ideal of existence. One cannot analyze existence from a neutral point of view. One must have made a choice which is not subject to examination in order to be open to the phenomenon of existence. Man is a finite being and capable of absolute knowledge. His very knowledge of his finiteness is finite. We may also say commitment can only be understood by an understanding which is itself committed, which is a specific commitment. Or existential philosophy is subjective truth about the subjectivity of truth. To speak in general terms, rational philosophy has been guided by the distinction between the objective, which is true, and the subjective, which is opinion, or an equivalent of this distinction. On the basis of existentialism, what was formerly called objective reveals itself to be as superficial, problematic, and what was formerly called subjective reveals itself as profound, assertoric, with the understanding that there is no apodicticity. Okay, I won't really explain that, but I do want to say, for those of you who are following along, who know some Heidegger and who have a sense of what Strauss is saying here, that this is where I think Strauss is on his weakest foundation concerning the meaning of Heidegger's work. Okay, so I have a book called Beginning with Heidegger, where I have a chapter on Strauss. I do my best to say and to show why I think Strauss's reading of Heidegger may fall short at the philosophical level. And as somebody who's taught Heidegger, read Heidegger, and thought about Heidegger a lot and continues to do so, although I love Strauss and he's the first authority for me in the realm of political philosophy, I find these characterizations a little bit dubious. But let's continue all the same. The great achievement of Heidegger was the coherent exposition of the experience of existence, okay, of Dasein, of human existence. A coherent exposition based on the experience of existence, of the essential character of existence. Kierkegaard had spoken of existence within the traditional horizon, i.e. within the horizon of the traditional distinction between essence and existence. Heidegger tried to understand existence out of itself. Yet, the analytics of existence was exposed to serious difficulties, which eventually induced Heidegger to find a fundamentally new basis. That is to say, to break with existentialism. And here, we probably can assume that Strauss is referring to Heidegger's turn from the analytic of Dasein in Being and Time to the quote-unquote middle period works that deal with the history of philosophy or the history of being, the being historical works, my favorite of which is the contributions to philosophy of the event, finding a fundamentally new basis. Let's see how Strauss continues, though. I shall mention now some of those difficulties. 1. Heidegger demanded, so this is Strauss talking about the difficulties that induced Heidegger to break with the analytic of existence, the analytic of Dasein, to break with his approach from being and time. Let's see what he says about that. Heidegger demanded from philosophy that it should liberate itself completely from traditional or inherited notions, which were mere survivals of former ways of thinking. He mentioned especially concepts that were of Christian theological origin. Yet, his understanding of existence was obviously of Christian origin. Conscience, guilt, being unto death, anguish, okay, those are key notions from Being and Time. So Heidegger, although drawing on key notions from Christian origin, at the same time said that we should ditch concepts that are mere survivals of former ways of thinking, and yet his own analysis didn't do that, and that's one reason why it failed, according to Strauss. 2, or one difficulty it faced, let's say. 2, the fact that the analytics of existence was based on a specific ideal of existence made one wonder whether the analysis was not fundamentally arbitrary. 3, the analytics of existence had culminated in the assertion that there can be no truth, and hence no to be, if there are no human beings. This is true, Heidegger does say this. While there can be beings, for example, the sun and the earth, if there are no human beings, this is hard, that there should be beings without that by virtue of which beings are. Let me just restate that in case you totally missed it. There's no to be without human beings. There are beings. There's still birds. There's still cups. Without human beings, it's not like the universe ceases to exist. There are still beings, but there's no being. And for Strauss, that's hard, that's strange, that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. That's hard, okay? That there should be beings without that by virtue of which beings are. without being. The highest form of knowledge was said to be finite knowledge of finiteness. Yet how can finiteness be seen as finiteness if it is not seen in the light of infinity? Or in other words, it was said that we cannot know the whole, but does this not necessarily presuppose awareness of the whole? Professor Hawking stated this difficulty neatly as follows. Desespoir presupposes espoir, and espoir presupposes love. Is then not love rather than despair the fundamental phenomenon? So in other words, if you're only aware of your finiteness, okay, you saw the point here, right? Doesn't it presuppose awareness of the whole, or presuppose awareness of the light of infinity? Is therefore not that which man ultimately loves, God, the ultimate ground? These objections which Heidegger made to himself were fundamentally the same objections which Hegel had made to Kant. The relation of Heidegger to his own existentialism is the same as that of Hegel to Kant. The objections mentioned would seem to lead to the consequence that one cannot escape metaphysics, Plato and Aristotle. This consequence is rejected by Heidegger. The return to metaphysics is impossible. But what is needed is some repetition of what metaphysics intended on an entirely different plane. Existence cannot be the clue to the understanding of that by virtue of which all beings are. Existence must rather be understood in the light of that by virtue of which all beings are. From this point of view, the analytics of existence, or the analytics of Dasein, the work of being and time, and so on, appears still to partake of modern subjectivism. I, Strauss writes, have compared the relation of Heidegger to existentialism with the relation of Hegel to Kant. Hegel may be said to have been the first philosopher who was aware that his philosophy belongs to his time. Heidegger's criticism of existentialism can therefore be expressed as follows. Existentialism claims to be the insight into the essential character of man, the final insight, which as such would belong to the final time, to the fullness of time. And yet, existentialism denies the possibility of a fullness of time. The historical process is unfinishable. Man is and always will be a historical being. In other words, existentialism claims to be the understanding of the historicity of man, and yet it does not reflect about its own historicity, of its belonging to a specific situation of Western man. Again, I'm not so sure that that's true of being in time. I will say that this becomes much more conspicuous in the quote-unquote middle period works, like Contributions to Philosophy of the Event, and so on, but it's another formulation of Strauss's that makes me suspicious whether that's really fair to say about being in time. But anyways, let's continue. It becomes therefore necessary, sorry, I gotta find out, where's my screen here? It becomes therefore necessary to return from Kierkegaard's existing individual who has nothing but contempt for Hegel's understanding of man in terms of universal history to that Hegelian understanding. The situation to which existentialism belongs can be seen to be liberal democracy. More precisely, a liberal democracy which has become uncertain of itself or of its future. Existentialism belongs to the decline of Europe or of the West. This insight has grave consequences. Let us look back for a moment to Hegel. Hegel's philosophy knew itself to belong to a specific time. As the completion or perfection of philosophy, it belonged to the completion or fullness of time. This meant for Hegel that it belonged to the post-revolutionary state, to Europe united under Napoleon, non-feudal, equality of opportunity, even free enterprise, but a strong government not dependent on the will of the majority, yet expressive of the general will, which is the reasonable will of each, recognition of the rights of man or of the dignity of every human being, the monarchic head of the state guided by a first-rate and highly educated civil service. Society thus constructed was the final society. History had come to its end. Precisely because history had come to its end, the completion of philosophy had become possible. The owl of Minerva commences its flight at the beginning of dusk. The completion of history is the beginning of the decline of Europe, of the West, and therewith, since all other cultures have been absorbed into the West, the beginning of the decline of mankind. There is no future for mankind. Almost everyone rebelled against Hegel's conclusion, no one more powerfully than Marx. He pointed out the untenable character of the post-revolutionary settlement and the problem of the working class with all its implications. There arose the vision of a world society which presupposed and established forever the complete victory of the town over the country, of the Occident over the Orient, which would make possible the full potentialities of each on the basis of man having become completely collectivized. The man of the world's society, who is perfectly free and equal, is so in the last analysis because all specialization, all division of labor has been abolished. All division of labor has been seen to be due ultimately to private property. The man of the world's society goes hunting in the forenoon, paints at noon, philosophizes in the afternoon, works in the garden after the sun has set. He's a perfect jack of all trades. Okay, a Marxist vision there. No one questioned the communist vision with greater energy than Nietzsche. He identified the man of the communist world society as the last man, that is to say, as the extreme degradation of man. This did not mean, however, that Nietzsche accepted the non-communist society of the 19th century or its future. As all continental European conservatives, he saw in communism only the consistent completion of democratic egalitarianism and of that liberalistic demand for freedom, which was not a freedom for, but only a freedom from. But in contradiction to the European conservatives, he saw that conservatism as such is doomed. For all merely defensive positions are doomed, all merely backward-looking positions are doomed. The future was with democracy and with nationalism, and both were regarded by Nietzsche as incompatible with what he saw to be the task of the 20th century. He saw the 20th century to be the age of world wars, leading up to planetary rule. If man were to have a future, this rule would have to be exercised by a united Europe. And the enormous tasks of such an iron age could not possibly be discharged, he thought, by weak and unstable governments dependent upon democratic public opinion. The new situation required the emergence of a new aristocracy. It had to be a new nobility, a nobility formed by a new ideal. This is the most obvious meaning, and for this reason also the most superficial meaning, of his notion of the Superman. All previous notions of human greatness would not enable man to face the infinitely increased responsibility of the planetary age. The invisible rulers of that possible future would be the philosophers of the future. It is certainly not an overstatement to say that no one has ever spoken so greatly and so nobly of what a philosopher is as Nietzsche. This is not to deny that the philosophers of the future, as Nietzsche described them, remind much more than Nietzsche himself seems to have thought of Plato's philosophers. For while Plato had seen the features in question as clearly as Nietzsche, and perhaps more clearly than Nietzsche, he had intimated rather than stated his deepest insights. But there is one decisive difference between Nietzsche's philosophy of the future and Plato's philosophy. Nietzsche's philosopher of the future is an heir to the Bible. He's an heir to that deepening of the soul which has been affected by the biblical belief in a God that is holy. The philosopher of the future, as distinguished from the classical philosophers, will be concerned with the holy. His philosophizing will be intrinsically religious. This does not mean that he believes in God, the biblical God. He is an atheist, but an atheist who is waiting for a God who has not yet shown himself. And I interject here, Strauss may be indirectly alluding as well to Heidegger's notion of the last God. He has broken with the biblical faith, also and especially because the biblical God as the creator of the world is outside the world. Compared with the biblical God as the highest good, the world is necessarily less than perfect. In other words, the biblical faith necessarily leads, according to Nietzsche, to otherworldliness or asceticism. The condition of the highest human excellence is that man remains or becomes fully loyal to the earth, that there's nothing outside the world which could be of any concern to us, be it a God or ideas or atoms of which we could be certain by knowledge or by faith. Every concern for such a ground of the world as is outside of the world, i.e. of the world in which man lives, alienates man from his world. Such concern is rooted in the desire to escape from the terrifying and perplexing character of reality, to cut down reality to what a man can bear. It is rooted in a desire for comfort. Nietzschean analysis. The First World War shook Europe to its foundations. Men lost their sense of direction. The faith in progress decayed. The only people who kept that faith in its original vigor were the communists. But precisely communism showed to the non-communists the delusion of progress. Spengler's Decline of the West seemed to be much more credible. But one had to be inhuman to leave it at Spengler's prognosis. Is there no hope for Europe and therewith for mankind? It was in the spirit of such hope that Heidegger perversely welcomed 1933. He became disappointed and withdrew. What did the failure of the Nazis teach him? Nietzsche's hope for a united Europe ruling the planet, for a Europe not only united but revitalized by this new transcendent responsibility of planetary rule, had proved to be a delusion. A world society controlled either by Washington or Moscow appeared to be approaching. For Heidegger, it did not make a difference whether Washington or Moscow would be the center. America and Soviet Russia are metaphysically the same. Quoting Heidegger, what is decisive for him is that this world society is, to him, more than a nightmare. He calls it the night of the world. It means indeed, as Marx had predicted, the victory of an ever more urbanized, ever more completely technological West over the whole planet. Complete leveling and uniformity, regardless whether it is brought about by iron compulsion or by soapy advertisement of the output of mass production. It means the unity of the human race on the lowest level, complete emptiness of life, self-perpetuating routine without rhyme and reason, no leisure, no concentration, no elevation, no withdrawal, but work and recreation, no individuals and no peoples, but lonely crowds. How can there be hope? Fundamentally because there is something in man which cannot be satisfied by this world society, the desire for the genuine, for the noble, for the great. This desire has expressed itself in man's ideals, but all previous ideals have proved to be related to societies which were not world societies. The old ideals will not enable man to overcome the power, to master the power of technology. We may also say a world society can be human only if there's a world culture, a culture genuinely uniting all men. But there never has been a high culture without a religious basis. The world society can be human only if all men are genuinely united by a world religion. But all existing religions are steadily undermined as far as their effective power is concerned by the progress toward a technological world society. There forms itself an open or concealed world alliance of the existing religions, which are united only by their common enemy, atheistic communism. Their union requires, by the way, think about it, this is not so far off base 60 years later, is it? Their union requires that they conceal from themselves and from the world the fact that they are incompatible with each other, that each regards the other as indeed noble but untrue. This is not very promising. On the other hand, man cannot make or fabricate a world religion. He can only prepare it by becoming receptive to it, and he becomes receptive to it if he thinks deeply enough about himself and his situation. Man's humanity is threatened with extinction by technology. Technology is the fruit of rationalism, and rationalism is the fruit of Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy is the condition of the possibility of technology, and therefore at the same time of the impasse created by technology. There is no hope beyond technological mass society if there are no essential limitations to Greek philosophy, the root of technology, to say nothing of modern philosophy. Greek philosophy was the attempt to understand the whole. It presupposed, therefore, that the whole is intelligible, or that the grounds of the whole are essentially intelligible at the disposal of man as man, that they are always, and therefore in principle always accessible to man. This view is the condition of the possibility of human mastery of the whole, but that mastery leads, if its ultimate consequences are drawn, to the ultimate degradation of man. This is Strauss reconstructing an argument, Heidegger's view of these matters. Only by becoming aware of what is beyond human mastery can we have hope. Transcending the limits of rationalism requires the discovery of the limits of rationalism. Rationalism is based on a specific understanding of what being means, that to be means primarily to be present, to be ready at hand, and therefore that to be in the highest sense means to be always present, to be always. You see Strauss returning time and again to that point. This basis of rationalism proves to be a dogmatic assumption. Rationalism itself rests on non-rational, unevident assumptions. In spite of its seemingly overwhelming power, rationalism is hollow. Rationalism itself rests on something which it cannot master. This assumption that to be means to be always. A more adequate understanding of being is intimated by the assertion that to be means to be elusive, or to be a mystery. This is the Eastern understanding of being. Hence, there is no will to mastery in the East. We can hope beyond technological world society for a genuine world society only if we become capable of learning from the East, especially from China. But China succumbs to Western rationalism. There is needed a meeting of the West and the East. I will say nothing here in passing about Eurasianism, That wouldn't be fair. The West has to make its own contribution to the overcoming of technology. The West has first to recover within itself that which would make possible a meeting of West and East. The West has to recover within itself its deepest roots, which antedate its rationalism, which in a way antedate the separation of West and East. No genuine meeting of West and East is possible on the level of present-day thought, i.e. in the form of the meeting of the most vocal, most glib, most superficial representatives of the most superficial period of both West and East. The meeting of West and East can only be a meeting of the deepest roots of both. Heidegger, Strauss writes, is the only man who has an inkling of the dimensions of the problem of a world society. The Western thinker can prepare that meeting by descending to the deepest roots of the West. Within the West, the limitations of rationalism were always seen by the biblical tradition. Here lies the justification for the biblical elements in Heidegger's earlier thought. But this must be rightly understood. Biblical thought is one form of Eastern thought. By taking the Bible as absolute, one blocks the access to other forms of Eastern thought. Yet the Bible is the East within us, within Western man. Not the Bible, but the Bible as Eastern can help us in overcoming Greek rationalism. The deepest root, Strauss says, getting close to the end here, the deepest root of the West is a specific understanding of being, a specific experience of being. The specifically Western experience of being led to the consequence that the ground of grounds was forgotten, and the primary experience of being was used only for the investigation of the beings. The East has experienced being in a way which prevented the investigation of beings, and therewith the concern with the mastery of beings. But the Western experience of being makes possible in principle coherent speech about being. By opening ourselves to the problem of being and to the problematic character of the Western understanding of being, we may gain access to the deepest root of the East. The ground of grounds, which is indicated by the word being, will be the ground not only of religion, but even of any possible gods. From here, one can begin to understand the possibility of a world religion. And in the final paragraph, the meeting of East and West depends on an understanding of being. Incidentally, I think that's a nice formulation as well of the key concern of Alexander Dugin's Eurasianism. But fine, at a philosophical level, but never mind that if you don't want to. The meeting of East and West depends on an understanding of being. More precisely, it depends on an understanding of that by virtue of which beings are. Esse, être, to be, as distinguished from entia, étant, beings. Esse, okay, the Latin to be. Esse, as Heidegger understands it, may be described crudely and superficially and even misleadingly, but not altogether misleadingly, by saying that it is a synthesis of Platonic ideas and the biblical God. It is as impersonal as the Platonic ideas and as elusive as the biblical God. Okay, so there we go. That was Leo Strauss on existentialism. You can find it. I think I put a link in the description, a link to this essay if you want to refer back to it. It's a lecture that he originally gave, but that was published in The Rebirth of Classical Political Rationalism, Introduction to the Thought of Leo Strauss. And I wanted to read it to you. It came up in private tutoring recently, and I thought, why not? There are some very crucial, memorable lines here. For example, about Heidegger being the greatest thinker, right? Only a great thinker could help us in our intellectual plight, but here's the great trouble. The only great thinker in our time is Heidegger. The other line that I highlighted for you in passing, right, that it would be unworthy of us, wholly unworthy of us as thinking beings, not to listen to the critics of democracy, even if they are enemies of democracy, provided they are thinking men and especially great thinkers and not blustering fools. I hope if you did listen to any part of this that you learned something about Strauss's own thoughtfulness, that you see there's sometimes more to Strauss than you might have heard about, that this helped you understand something about Heidegger. I would not take this as the last word on Heidegger, far from it, but hopefully it gave you something to think about. So thank you for being here. I'm Michael Millerman. I teach at millermanschool.com. I have this channel where we do readings like this from time to time, so like, share, subscribe if you want to. And I have a free introduction to philosophy at philosophyintro.com. That's all. We're going to leave it there for today. Leo Strauss on existentialism. I hope you enjoyed that. Feel free to comment and take care. Goodbye.